Hello and welcome to another edition of Ideological. I'm your host, Zach Lee, and today we have a special guest, Dr. Wilfred Reilly, who's the Associate Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University. Big into the political science scene, also excellent when it comes to cultural commentating. I highly encourage you to follow him on social media. He's got some great posts. Dr. Reilly, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Of course, yeah, glad to jump on.
Yeah. I want you to, for the people that might not know who you are, and several of my listeners will, but for those that might not know, do you mind giving us a little bit about your background as far as both personally and academically?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm from Chicago originally. I grew up in kind of a working class environment. My mom, Jean Ward, is actually from a pretty wealthy family. The Wards are a kind of Chicago black elite family, but she herself became an inner city school teacher. Was kind of a hippie in the 60s, I would suspect. My dad's white. He's a British / Irish guy, but very, very urban, both of them. And I kind of grew up where she taught. Like, I lived in Wicker Park on the north side of Chicago. I lived on the south side of Chicago for quite a while. I lived in East Aurora, which is a large working class suburb of Chicago. Aurora itself is the east side. It's kind of the traditionally, mostly Latino side of the city. But I went to high school there. I went to East Aurora Senior. So that's kind of my background. I was a pretty typical sort of city kid. This was that one movie kids era. Like, I had a skateboard and all that stuff. I went to an urban public school after an urban Catholic school. I had like a gold cross on a chain, a lot of white tees, very much like a male of that era in that region. But I was fairly intelligent, and partly due to training from mom and the family. And I ended up going to just the state colleges kind of in sequence. So I went to Southern Illinois for undergraduate school. I applied to law school. I got in. I went to the University of Illinois. And by this point, when I graduated, I was in my early 20s, early to mid. And I made one more application to Southern Illinois University. Again, I got into the PhD program in political science. And to some extent, I was just delaying adulthood at this time. You're 22 or 23, and it might sound more appealing to work on your Frisbee skills and chase girls for a while more than to, actually work for Jenner and Block or one of these law firms where, this is before AI. So the younger associates, you're the guy that's like reading through legal briefs and checking misspellings or something. This is going on 90 hours a week or whatever your billable time is. They have cots in the office, or you're working for a prosecutor's office and you're the guy sending people to jail for bags of weed. So I viewed this as I expected to be in the PhD program. I was arrogant like many young scholars are for maybe 4 years. In reality, my mom became sick and I had to return to Chicago to try to help her out. And actually, between that and the teaching I did in the city colleges in Chicago, working on bullpen sales and trading floors, primarily sales floors, that kind of thing. I worked for a street canvas group for a while as one of the infield managers. Between all that, I actually didn't get done with the PhD for about 9 years. So it was kind of a long experience returning to kind of urban life, seeing how that had changed over the years, and writing a page or two of the book every day as I did all these other things. As I watched people canvas for gay rights or close six-figure sales or start to get married. So, that actually is where a lot of my kind of nonfiction writing comes from, about these different sectors of life. But anyway, I completed that. And basically at that point forward, kind of like the edgy young male stuff was over. Like, I just got a job. Like, I applied to a couple state U's. I was pretty good. I'd published in grad school and I got hired. So I went to Kentucky State and all the other, generally when you're done with a doctoral dissertation, this is important for the young academics to understand. You're looking for another educational institution a quarter step down from yours where like someone has died or they're expanding the department. So you're kind of going where you're going. Like, you're looking for something with state in the name if you're not good enough to go Ivy. So, as I recall, it was like Central Connecticut, so Utah something or other, like Central Michigan. I don't mean to mislabel any of these places, but University of Wisconsin, Parkside. These were the sort of places I was applying. These are all good schools, by the way, like Research 2s. Kentucky State is quite solid as a historically black college. But I actually found the historically black college in Appalachia to be an interesting idea. Like, it seemed, it had state in the name, but it also seemed like it would be a place where you could actually help kids, where a lot of these people would be first generation college students. They'd be trying for law school. They'd be trying for the professions. And I could, with all banter aside, help them do that. And I'd had a somewhat similar experience. So when offers started coming in, I took that offer, and I really haven't regretted it. I've lived in Frankfurt for about 8 or 9 years. And it's like, I always liked the category provincial city. Like, I went to college in Champaign-Urbana, then in Carbondale, Illinois. And they're all very much that like population of like 100,000. And they have the museum for like the 2-county area and like the Capitol building. And that's what Frankfurt is. And Lexington, the other city in Kentucky, other than Louisville's in the next county. So like, I'm pretty content where I am right now, but that's the backstory.
I love it. That's super helpful. So you have a very unique background, being from the inner city Chicago, also having a JD and a PhD. So you get to do the legal side and kind of the academic research side. Today, we're primarily going to be talking about your most recent book. And for those that don't know, Dr. Reilly's written several books. They're all excellent. Highly recommend. But this one, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, you can probably see that in the background for him as well. One of the things that I really like about that, even though that title sounds like it's going to be just one-sided, the research in the book is excellently done. Dr. Reilly does a good job of pushing on one side, but then he'll also push the extremist on the other side. And so I've seen him debate guys on the alt-right, and then I've seen him debate people on the woke left. And so most of my questions are going to come out of this book. The first one is this. In your first chapter, can you refute this lie? The lie is that 19th century American slavery was one, unique, and two, the worst form of slavery. Can you talk with us some about that? Because I think most people, as soon as, especially in America, if we hear slavery, the only thing we think of is mid-1800s American slavery, which, to be clear, is bad. Nobody's supporting that. There's just no context to say, okay, is this the first time that happened? What was slavery like? So can you just give us kind of a brief overview of your research?
No, I think that's well put. It's a good question. If I can comment on one thing you said there, which is that I do tend to respond to the extremes on the right as well as the left. I think that's true. And I actually specifically, like, I'm sort of a center-right business type, if I had to define my background. You know, like I said, I come from that sort of sales floor world, or from the quantitative portion of the academy. Like I'm a guy in like a Brooks Brothers jacket. You know, I'm like, I very much like am what I look like. I could stand to lose a little weight, you know, eat less meat. You know, like I'm very much the type I appear to be. And so that is my background. I'm sincere about it. But I mean, there's a lot on the right that is to the right of that. And I think a lot of the things that they say are as crazy as anything on the left when you get into Christo nationalism or the taking of the vote away from citizen women. I mean, if you take a search engine other than Google, like Yandex, and you look up repeal the 19th, you see that petition, which began as a 4chan joke, now has 4 million signatures. I mean, people are dead serious about that. I mean, you're now seeing the idea of, well, the anti-DEI campaign, which I strongly support, is going to lead to a repeal of the Civil Rights Act. I can tell you that people that have led that campaign, like Chris Rufo, probably do not support that. Like, the support is for meritocracy. But I mean, there are a lot of people that would probably like to do in reverse what actually Martin and Malcolm did, which is backing colorblind equality right until you win and then shoving affirmative action through the door. I mean, like, there are people that would like to do that in reverse with racism, branded under something like free association or something like that. And yeah, I would oppose that. I think that in business or in academia, what you want is meritocracy. And that might sometimes limit something like free association. I mean, I'm sure are people that would like completely male-only spaces. You'd have more freedom of speech. But if you're talking about a research university, the downside of that is that you're cutting out 40 to 50% of the people that are going to develop new inventions that are going to save lives or something like that. So yeah, I have a pretty strongly negative view of some of the stuff that's coming out of the hard right as well. But in terms of your question, why did I talk more about
real quick? I'm sorry, real quick. I totally agree with that, by the way. You're seeing the rise of now what's called the woke right, where they're using identity politics and these kind of things and pushing the other side. Instead of just being a classical liberal, instead of having an Enlightenment ideal, they're taking the tools of the left and applying it. And that's not the goal either. The goal is kind of that Enlightenment classical liberal idea, individual rights, meritocracy. Anyway, I agree. So sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, it's very well said. Yeah, I think that it's hard for a lot of people to realize that not everyone on their team agrees with that. And I've seen real shock from like business women or Black conservatives or gay guys who happen to support a free market when they realize that a lot of the audience, if they're looking at the comments section on Twitter under something perfectly innocuous, say a Daily Wire video, that a lot of the people that they're engaging with don't actually agree with that and tend to dislike the group they're in as the group they're in. I don't see much difference between that from the right and that from the left. And beyond morality, there's a fantasy world component to it. Like, you know, I'm not going anywhere. Like, America's 12% Black. Like, we're still a little behind on the board test, but we're doing quite well in athletics, the arts. pretty well armed. Like, no, nobody's bringing back slavery. And not that anyone's proposing that. But, gay Americans, we now know that's 5% of people if you count women. Again, pretty well armed. Hispanics, 19%. So we can say things like we're not going to tolerate trash culture in these groups, frankly, like black criminals be arrested like any other criminals. But the idea that the USA is going to become some sort of ethno-state dominated by one group or any of this is fantasy. And it's a fantasy that needs to be called out when people bring it up. And last thing, but like in a lot of these debate spaces like Twitter and Reddit, the default seems to be almost kind of a bizarro world reverse classical liberalism where everyone's a bigoted asshole. So you have like there's a page called like Blacks Taking L's on Twitter, which has 180,000 followers. And instead of people just opposing that as, anti-racists unite or something, there's now a page called White Perverts and Racists, which has 160,000 followers. And those two will go at it every day. And I don't really think that there's a lot of positivity that comes out of like that type of shit. I don't really, keep it in the locker room. Like, I don't really think that's going to improve the discussion anywhere serious. But in terms of though the reason I called this out on the left first, though, and I think the reason that James Lindsay, Chris Rufo, like all of these guys, Jeremy Carl, focused on the left first, is that the left even now has much more institutional control than the right. Like Trump is challenging this. But if you're in a research university, and I mean, Trump's the president, so, you got to keep an eye on him too. But if you're in a research university or you're in a Fortune 500 corporation, there is a department of DEI. Like 3% of the entire enterprise is devoted to this stuff on the left. Like if you're in a boss role, you'll be asked, what do your numbers look like for black women, right? Like there's no equivalent on the right, at least until very recently. There's no department of Pepe. These are guys that are kind of just at home or, on the sales floor, on a VPN or on tour, kind of trolling the dominant authority. Now, they'd be just as bad if they were in power. That's important to realize. Like when the feminists took over from the sexists in a lot of industries, they were just as bad. The Pepe guys would be as bad as the people that are currently in power. But it's totally fair to focus primarily on the people that are in power. But to actually answer your question, no, slavery is not something that's unique to the West. And no, we did not have the worst form of slavery. If you actually go back and look through the old hieroglyphic languages at the first words and concepts humans developed, slave was among the first 10 written human words. I mean, in the Akkadian and Sumerian languages, there's a glyphic term for man from the mountains, like warrior from the hills, that was very commonly used in the lowland cities. You're talking about like Sargon of Akkad, this era of history. And that term with a slight alteration to it means slave. A slave is a defeated warrior. It's actually quite deep. Someone who came down from the mountains and lost. And from that point forward, there has been human slavery. The Greeks, 25% of the population of classical Athens in her glory was enslaved. The Romans, I mean, you had 60 to 130 million people in the empire, perhaps a third of them, maybe a little less, but more than a tenth definitely were slaves. Roman slave trade was one of the greatest slave trades in history, by the way. When we talk about, did the whites or the Arabs transship more people? The answer would probably be the Romans. The Romans, Julius Caesar's book on the Gallic Wars opens all France was in 3 parts, meaning he conquered the entire country, killed half the population, and enslaved everybody else. This is what the Romans did. They would take your entire country and ship all of the men to some far-flung frontier as Janissary soldiers. So they were the people that did this at a level no one had ever thought possible. Even the arena in Rome, when you think about that, perhaps 100,000 men, that's an estimate, but were sacrificed every year. And they were forced to fight against other almost sapient creatures, baboons, elephants, the great cats. I mean, you're fighting with a spear against a lion. So that's a form of slavery that I don't think anyone, the whites, the blacks, so on, has equaled since then. Farming is not equivalent to having to fight off a baboon with a knife, But you go on from there to the Arab slave trade. That was 10 centuries, perhaps, of the Arabs against the civilized East and West African blacks, the black city-states, the Zanj. There's actually a period called the Zanj Wars when the Arabs captured so many Zanj fighters and brought them to places like Iraq, where they were clearing the Salt Delta in Iraq. I mean, like sort of literally hellish labor. the Zanj revolted. And this is one of the biggest wars in history. The war goes on for a decade. Millions of people were killed. Parts of the country were reduced to cannibalism. The Zanj finally lose. They're fighting too far from home. They didn't have a base of supply other than, I guess, the meat of dead enemies. So they're broken, sent back to the yoke. They were too useful to all kill. But I mean, you have this process of slavery that goes on for hundreds of years. Enslaves about 17 million people, I believe. Whites were also enslaved as part of the Arabic slave trade. You have the Barbary slave trade, which is related to this, but ties in the Berbers and black masters in the north of Africa, as well as people of Arabic descent. That's 3 million Caucasians. You have the Atlantic slave trade, which is a white run, no excuses there, but slave trade in blacks. That's 12 million people. So slavery is this sort of human vice that goes on all throughout human recorded history. And to reduce it to very simple terms without getting into these complex moral debates, in the past, before the Geneva Conventions, if you lost a battle or a series of battles, the two options, because there wasn't an infrastructure in place to care for you as a prisoner, were generally that you would be massacred, you'd be killed on the spot, or that you would be, moved somewhere where you could contribute to the agricultural development of the enemy nation. And that's how, the black slaves that came to America were people who'd lost wars with the Ashanti, the Goa, the slave raiding populations on the west coast of Africa, on the slave coast. And they were shipped to, what was thought of as the white man's world. The black kings who existed at a high medieval level knew that their white trading partners would buy slaves, so they sold them. So that's shameful and all that, but this is all part of this cycle that goes around the Atlantic world, goes into the Arabic world, and it goes back through history. So anyway, that's the actual reality of slavery. Associating it with black enslavement in the West during the 18th century is an incredible minimization.
That's great. Thank you. That's a fantastic answer. I've got a follow-up to that, because you mentioned in the book that in one sense there might have been more white people that were slaves. The first slave owner in America, I might have been a black man. So the question, based on everything you said, which is fantastic info, why do you think that there's only a focus? This is more of the political behind-the-scenes question. Why is there such a focus in our society on just one form of slavery, which we would all agree is bad? We're not saying that it's good. We're not supporting it. But why are they doing one to the extent, to exclude the exclusion of all the other types of slavery that you've mentioned, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, and first, just as you did, I'll go out on a limb and oppose slavery right here in this conversation. I'm against it. I don't think you should have slaves. I don't think you should have sex slaves. I don't even think you should have indentured servants, man. Slavery, it's bad.
Yeah, to be clear, everybody on the podcast does not like slavery. That's not the point. The point is, why does culture focus? Yeah, I agree with. We'll throw a graphic up here that's like no slavery. But my question is, because your book was fascinating to me, because I think we share a lot of opinions in this space. It was fascinating to me because these are all lies that I thought were just the mainstream kind of what you get in the different curricula and different universities, what I heard in school, that kind of stuff. Why do you think there is just a focus on American slavery in the 1800s to the exclusion of even some worse forms? Well, why don't they say everything? Why don't they say this slavery is bad, we condemn it, but we also condemn all these other forms? As soon as you try to go before the 1800s, there's crickets.
Well, I think that the reason is basically instrumental, and it ties into modern American politics. And I think this is pretty much all of it. So one of the arguments in the USA basically is that white people should give black people money. And the justification for that is slavery. We were enslaved. And I think this takes two forms. One is the enslavement that black Americans suffered was unique. White Americans couldn't understand it. They can't respond to it, so pay us. And if you point out, well, in fact, a number of groups, including the Irish in the USA, were subjected to almost this same set of conditions. I would agree the Irish were indenturees. They weren't slaves. But when the Irish 23 years were brought here, when they were brought here under contracts that said you're going to slave for 7 to 23 years, then you'll be free. The average life expectancy for a male was 25 years. So, if we actually take a look at history, it's pretty complex and bloody. And in fact, many white groups, the Irish, the Italians, people who are 50% Native American, could say, well, no, much the same thing happened to us. Your experience was worse. But the government can't just pay everyone, women, that had a terrible time in the past. So it's in fact politically useful to distract from these other experiences here and elsewhere. I think that's a very important point. And this also gets into why you don't see, and I think this is an even better point, why you don't see Western blacks making these appeals to powerful countries outside America and the UK. Because if you look at the slave trade, I mean, many of these players like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Dubai, Spain, Portugal, Nigeria, Ghana, Oman, they're still around today and they're pretty significant countries. I mean, Nigeria is the poorest I mentioned and they're a G30 economy. So why don't you present them with a bill and say, well, okay, today your country, you've discovered oil, you're worth $199 billion. Why don't you give us 20,000 apiece? The reason for that is that the elected president of Nigeria or the king of Saudi Arabia would put you up in the Four Seasons for 4 nights and then very politely tell you to get the hell out of the country and never come back. I mean, that's what would happen. And that's what has happened when Jesse Jackson and others have tried this. I believe Jesse is banned from a couple of countries for doing this. So once you have that experience, you realize, well, if we want this money, we're going to have to pursue and guilt a particular group of people that follow a particular bluntly slave morality, and we're going to find them in the West. So it might behoove us to not allow these comparisons that are pretty valid. So I personally, cynically think that's why you don't see comparisons to the Irish experience here, or that's why you don't see pitches made to Nigeria and Saudi Arabia, Egypt. I mean, Egypt is poorer than the West, but is a mighty country. Like that's the only logical reason.
That's good.
I think that's the main thing. I also think that below the educated class that's aware of the main thing, a lot of people just don't know what we're talking about. I mean, we're two, wits on a podcast. Most people, 41% of American post-high school individuals, I guess high school graduates, think that only the USA ever had slaves. So there's also an element of this narrative has been very successful over the past 3 or 4 generations and creeping into the public consciousness. Another poll recently came out. I forget who this was from. It might have been Skeptic Research Center. But they found that 2/3 of Black women and 1/3 of liberal white women think that white people in the modern West invented slavery. So again, when we're talking about all this stuff, Gladiator, Prince of Persia, even Aladdin, I mean, who do you think he escaped from? What was he stealing to pay off? I mean, but if you somehow can put all that in a box and say, well, slavery was invented by the US and the UK in 1619, that's going to really limit your ability to investigate these other societies. That was something different, a much friendlier system. And the reality is that, of course, it wasn't. Chattel slavery simply means slavery where you own people as things that can be bought. And that was all slavery throughout history. The idea that there were markets where you could buy and sell battle captives or fertile young women, hate to put it that way, but any of these groups of people, that would have been understood by the Vikings. It would have been understood by the heavily Black Moors. It would have been understood by pirates and corsairs of any race. This was just what reality was. And there's only so much of an extent to which you can camouflage that, I think.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great explanation. My second question kind of piggybacks on that one, and it has to do with the narrative around Native Americans. Okay. We have a tendency to believe that Native Americans were people that just kind of honored the earth and danced all day. As you mentioned, that's kind of what we think. We think of some, cowboy and Indian Western movie or something like that. My question is, 1, is that true? But 2, and this is why it piggybacks off the previous question, why is there not just a condemnation of all forms of violence? Why is there just a focus on the atrocities the British, enacted again and early America enacted against Native Americans? Tell us a little bit about what the narrative is around Native Americans and then what the reality is.
Well, first of all, I mean, no, some of these questions are kind of slow pitches across the plate as they're intended to be. And no, Native Americans are not peaceful people who spent, I think the chapter title is All Day and Dancing and Making Love. No, the natives are some of the greatest warriors in history. When the Native Americans encountered technology brought over by the whites, like the horse, the metal-tipped lance, and so on, they became, other than the Mongols, arguably the greatest warriors in history. It took 400 years of constant back and forth slugging for the whites, who were no slouches themselves, Scots-Irish men captured Black raiders, English soldiers, pensioned off regulars and so on. These people to move the Indians over 5 or 10 miles at a time. So the Comanche Lancers and so on were nothing to play with. The last Indian raid, I think, took place in 1910. So the natives were not extraordinarily peaceful people, the Apache and the Comanche and so on, the Iroquois. And they weren't especially peaceful people before we got here either. Anthropologists, especially in the feminist vein, have tried to recover once we found all this evidence of native victories by generals like Little Turtle and so on against the whites. They've tried to say, well, perhaps the whites taught them the evils of violence as they came into an uncorrupted Eden, and the the natives were forced to defend themselves and so on. No, as we've gone deeper into the former Aztec lands, or as we started investigating the sizable cities that were governed by the Anasazi, the ancient ones, and so on, we now know that was nonsense as well. There was a recent article in American Archaeology that was just titled "The Most Violent Time in U.S. History Was Before Whites Arrived." And we know this is actually one of my obsessions in general with history, that people have risen and fallen many times, and we don't even know how many. Probably, I wouldn't be surprised if we found 20,000-year-old cities on Australia or Antarctica at some point. We're just absolutely shocked. We find steam engines among the ruined, banyan trees and blocks of ice. But anyway, whether or not that's true or it's just absolute fantasy, we do know that even in the continents we're aware of, sizable civilizations, the Anasazi, the Maya, so on, have risen and fallen. And they've generally fallen through violence or through very modern style misallocation of resources, like failure to deal with climatic change is what got the Maya. At any rate, in the American Archaeology piece, the Anasazi began to consume resources at a rapid rate. They began to irritate and provoke surrounding tribes. There were a bunch of wars. And what happened is that cities that had a population density of up to 40,000, the population fell to zero. There were a bunch of bloody wars. And there are ways to tell when someone is killed by violence. There are defensive wounds as you try to shield your face. There are cracks in your head that are the size of an arrow or a stone or bronze arrowhead or a hatchet. If the people are a bit more advanced, there can be stone or metal sword blades that are cutting into your body, clubs. So metal swords wouldn't have existed in the USA at this time. Everything else did. But there's a breakdown of these people fought frequently, and they fought very skillfully prior to the arrival of the whites. After the whites arrived, the fighting intensified a little bit, not very much. And this is in North America, which is thinly populated. If you go down to Mesoamerica and South America, the Aztecs and Incas had full-on empires that had passed that sort of pyramid building, make the king and emperor stage that the old worlders didn't get to until 2000 or 1500 BC. The Aztec king declared himself a god and was sacrificing people to the gods and, kicking bodies down the temple steps for people to eat. And the surrounding peoples were utterly dominated by the Aztecs, who almost farmed them, which is what actually enabled the Spanish, as you probably know, to defeat the Aztecs in battle. The Spanish were quite good, but so were the Aztecs. The Chiluans, the Tlaxcalans, all these other people that were a little weaker than the Aztecs joined with the Spanish immediately when the Spanish arrived, because they were tired of the Aztecs taking these kind of Theseus and the Minotaur style sacrifices from their communities every year or twice a year at these gigantic, brutal festivals where they were, in our terms, sacrificed to demons. So anyway, the Native Americans were not extraordinarily peaceful. They weren't necessarily any more brutal than the Carthaginians or the Romans, though. They were just very human. I think that's the through line when you look at them. Some great poets, some fascinating ballads. If you actually read the Hiawatha story, so on, some societies where women were very highly valued, like the cultivator Iroquois, but also deadly killers. Skilled longbowmen, cannibals, that kind of thing. So no, the kind of dances with German shepherds narrative around Native Americans is fiction.
Yeah, there is this, what we're seeing is these vices are not just race-specific, country-specific, whatever, they're human-specific, whether it's murder, slavery, rape. And the focus on one is typically a political power play. That leads to your chapter on, I'm kind of doing these out of order. I hope that's okay. But that leads to your chapter, which I thought it was my favorite chapter in the book, which was the one on colonialism. Because what you did is you highlighted something I think that's really, really helpful. What we do is we have a tendency to think that colonialism is somebody coming and taking their culture and imposing it on another culture. And that culture on which they're imposing it is kind of, Rousseau's version of a noble savage, where everything is fine and there's no oppression and there's nothing bad. And you do a good job highlighting that, no, what you have is you have a culture that's hurting people, and sometimes they get colonized by a culture that hurts people less. I also found it really interesting where when people condemn all forms of colonialism, and again, I'm not saying everything in colonialism is good. Some of that stuff is bad. We're just trying to say there was already bad as well. It wasn't good replaced by bad. It was bad replaced by maybe less bad, sometimes equally as bad. What's interesting is when people condemn that, they are ironically reading Western cultural values of their, colonialization. It's almost an academic colonialization back onto those cultures. What are your thoughts on the colonization issue, colonialism, good, bad, ugly, just however you want to unpack that.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's kind of interesting is, like, you opened with a conversation about vices when you said, military, vengeance, militarization of society, rape, murder, warfare. Except for rape, I'm not sure that I would describe most of those as vices, which I think is an interesting illustration. I'm not really criticizing you, but that's an interesting illustration of kind of the pacifistic, almost
I mean, to our culture, just because I meant to our culture, because I think there's righteous war. Like the Nazis were stopped by war. So there is righteous killing, unrighteous killing. There is, whatever. So yeah, I agree with you. Just to be clear, I'm just kind of pitching it as the way our culture typically hears it of all violence is bad and all elitism is bad and whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, so first of all, I don't think that ultimate right and wrong exist at all. This is a point I make in pretty much every serious conversation I have about ethics and so on. That doesn't mean I don't think that there are reasonable sets of rules, like the pre-woke UN human rights codicils, I believe, of 1950, like we're going to pass laws against rape. We think drinking water is good. Roads are better than no roads. Like, I mean, I think that humans can arrive at things that, let's say, 98% of what did the natives call it? The diddly warriors and long-haired women who talk around the fire can agree. Like, the smart people in society can say, like, okay, that makes sense. You want to have paths we can walk down and farms that grow food. Okay. So, I mean, I think in that sense, sure, you can have good, bad. But I don't think that there is a non-human being that judges what we do in a world beyond this one. Like, if there's a God, it's probably of the watchmaker deist variety, and I'm not sure there is. So I think when we say that there is an ultimate evil, killing is never okay, I would agree with you. First of all, like, killing Nazis is good. But I also think that good is limited to the realm of the human or the humane that we define. I don't think it has a meaning beyond that, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I appreciate that you say that, because I feel like what is often the case in the agendas of American school are value statements. Like, I remember asking ChatGPT for something recently, and it was saying good and bad. I'm like, just freaking give me the facts. I don't care if it's... So I think our culture does a weird thing where they look at one of these things and they say good or bad, but that's not what you're doing with your research. With your research, you're just showing this is not unique.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. So, I mean, I guess the first point there was just, I don't think ultimate right and wrong, it really exists. And I think, I mean, sounds like we're kind of on the same page there. There's some stuff you shouldn't do, eat people or rape kids. There's stuff 99% of people will agree on. You'll get crucified if you do, logically enough. But I mean, so I'm not sure the gods are watching us in the first place. But your point was a more sophisticated point than that, actually, which is that even in light of the things that in our society, the average, say, upper middle class woman would classify as bad, colonialism was very often not bad. I would agree with that too. First of all, I would say that the average upper middle class woman's perception of morality in the USA is pretty badly flawed. I don't mean to get sexist or hypercritical, but like actually pursuing her system to its logical conclusions would lead to social decline and millions of deaths. So like I've had friendly debates with people from like NOW and WOLF, National Organization of Women and so on, online, where I've asked, I mean, what would your immigration policy be? And it's just sort of like, well, we couldn't do this, this, and this. So in practice, we would let in tens of millions of unvetted third world males. Okay, what would your abortion policy be? Well, in practice, we'd be slaughtering babies up until month 9. I mean, like, so I don't really take a lot of that stuff all that seriously. Like, there's a very good case for the gold. Wolf was less crazy than NOW on these points, by the way. But like, there's a serious case for the golden mean, that if you take the male virtue of bravery to its logical extent, you get foolhardy butchery. And that's true. But if you take the female coded virtue of empathy to its logical extent, you get suicide. And you literally get suicide. You get the Jain, in the Indian sense, Jain, conclusion, I am drawing air from at least one more worthwhile person, therefore I should stop drawing air. It's impossible to avoid that conclusion without a certain sense of amoral ruthlessness. And I think amoral ruthlessness is good because rules aren't real, we just made them all up. You should logically pursue your own self-interest, Adam Smith style. There is no deeper rule than that. But anyway, going back to the point though, yes, even in the sense of modern gynocratic upper middle class morality, colonialism often brought more good than bad. And the reason for that is that the colonizers, if you're talking about the British or the French, for example, And I think you have to set a time frame for this. Bruce Gilley makes a good point about this. You can't use Viking colonialism or something, or African Zulu colonialism. You have to say, European after 1600 or something. But within that time frame, the British colonizers, for example, were often much less guilty of the things we think of as sins today than the people that they were defeating. The people they were defeating, like Zulu warriors, were also often, one, highly civilized or highly advanced, metal weapons and all that, and two, very guilty of these vices. So the idea that everyone was sort of sitting around in a field playing with daisies, Eloy-like, and then like the white man showed up on the horizon and you heard like in Disney movies, literally like the beat of the drum and people started walking into the field with these new weapons that throw thunder. That's not what happened. I mean, so yeah, colonialism often like where the cruel white king unseated the cruel minority king, but then built schools. Like, yeah, often good.
That's right. Thank you. Very helpful.
Well, can I add one more line about that?
Please, of course.
When a typical case of actual colonialism might be the Brits against the Maoris in New Zealand, where you had a highly civilized, or none of these people are civilized in our terms. Nobody's voting. You had a highly advanced, they're growing potatoes, well-built, mud-chinked longhouses. You had an advanced group of people who lived in what we call a native society that's developed to the chiefdom, if not the state level. They have a quite well-organized government. Some of the best soldiers you'll find. People still don't want to fight Pacific Islanders today. And they're going against the British red-coated regulars who managed to beat them using, a good deal of slaughter and some tactics, but casualties high on both sides. And once this takes place, the Brits are able to institute what we would think of as modern law. So constant conflict between villages is stopped. Cannibalism mostly stops. The capture of women for gang rape mostly stops. This is one of the reasons for the wars. It was sort of the only reward, if you want to put it that way. Other than that, being stabbed is quite unpleasant. So all of this ends, and most of the people, about 80-90% of the women and well over half of the men, when they were polled later on, because again, these are large, pleasant villages where you can walk around and talk to people and there's no state of war. When representatives of the government go and talk to them 10 or 15 years later, most people say they're happy with this. It had been very difficult for them to stop the constant state of war because no one wanted to be thought a coward. You had all these sort of blood debts that were owed to the next village. But if a more powerful king were able to come in and say, well, that's it, it's over, one last rugby match or something to settle the situation between you two guys, and then it's over, and they literally did things like this, then people are going to be happy. There may be some lingering hatred for one generation, but then the beef is done. So I think that sort of thing happened quite a lot and was good. And we've been sort of intentionally fed a narrative where it didn't, where Maori cannibalism was wildly exaggerated. And in fact, people lived in a state of peace and the British came in and caused tensions between pre-existing tribal communities. That almost never, reading between the lines, happened.
That's helpful. Very helpful. Let me ask this. I want to switch a little bit because we've mainly been talking about kind of race and colonialism. I want to talk about the sexual revolution.
Okay.
I mean, we obviously live in an age of a Sophie Rain and Bonnie Blue and all these kind of things. I think it was something like, I can't remember, you had tweeted out recently that something like 2% of all women 2%. Are on OnlyFans? And yeah. So 1 out of every 50, every time you're at the gym, just think one of these people. Was the sexual revolution and second wave feminism good for women like we're told, or was it harmful to them? That's obviously the softball question. Let me rephrase it. We're told this is just a good thing and it just empowers women and nothing bad happens. One of the things I think you do a good job of in this chapter is bringing out, hey, there's a cost to this. There's not just empowering women. There is women being used by cult leaders. There's all that. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the negative effects of the sexual revolution and second wave feminism?
Sure. And I personally think third wave feminism, and which began at the tail end of this chapter, was much worse for women than second wave jobs and orgasm of feminism. I would say the first two waves combined were good. The second two were trash. But well,
let's talk about the third, because we're now kind of on what they call the fourth wave of feminism with the transgender movement. But let's talk about the third wave then, where you also end up getting the racial element that's involved in third wave and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, feel free. Whatever wave you want to address, I'm good with.
Yeah, I mean, so basically the sexual revolution chapter is a chapter where I make the point that, and this isn't a chapter like even the colonialism chapter, where I say this was mostly good for most of the countries involved. I mean, for countries like Nigeria and Indonesia, where you had very powerful, quote unquote, native kings already, who were highly civilized and were extremely brutal. Read about the kingdom of the Ashanti sometime. The king had an executioner who followed him around with a sword everywhere he went. I mean, a massive, broad tree-lined streets, but also lunatic king that would have you killed at any moment. I think the British made that society, which is modern Ghana, better. Now, a Ghanaian might argue with you about that, but he'd be arguing based on the per capita GDP of the place if you took the gold in Ashanti and valued it in modern terms or something. He wouldn't be arguing from a civil rights perspective. So I think you could defend what I said there pretty easily. But in the case of the sexual revolution chapter, I'm not even making that point. Like this was largely a positive, as controversial as that point is. I'm kind of saying what you said, like there's a clear trade-off here. And when we talk about the hippie movement or the feminist movement or the civil rights movement, that's rarely how this is presented. Hippies in particular, which is what I opened the chapter with, I use some kind of language like the shaggy, hitted and crotched flower children, but they're presented as kind of the good guys who are going up against Nixon and Johnson's men who are kicking in the doors of the temple and shooting innocent Kent State students. And I say that this wasn't what happened. There's a lot of negative stuff to be said about the Russian-funded aspect of the peace movement, about the violent anti-war movement where you had these big muscular guys burning their draft notices and refusing to fight, just yada, 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 so on down the line. But in terms of the sexual revolution specifically, I guess point one, obviously there was some good to men and women being able to more openly discuss sexuality and challenge relationship roles. What's sometimes called the orgasm gap between men and women has shrunk pretty dramatically, for example. So men are usually open to bluntly go down on women now. But we receive the same benefits. So, the idea that guys dislike blowjobs or that it's entirely bad that couples are more sexually free today than they were in 1950 is obviously pretty silly.
But everybody's winning. Everybody wins today. Yeah, everybody wins today.
Yeah, sort of. The flip side of this, though, is that traditionally there were a large number of norms attached to sexuality. Like as a woman, you weren't automatically expected to have sex until at least the third or fourth date in a relationship. And very often, that was a little wild. That was like the Cosmo girl advice. And very often until you were married or you had a ring on your finger. And then, honestly, both men and women, unless there was abuse in a relationship, were expected to sleep with their partner most of the time when their partner wanted to. Not if you were pushed or bullied or abused, but if you were married, you were expected to keep your partner reasonably satisfied. So you didn't have to have sex until you felt comfortable with someone. Then the expectation was marriage. And in marriage, both sexes were expected to do anything reasonable the other person wanted. And it turned out this worked reasonably well for most people most of the time. I think older marriage manuals break down what are sometimes called the 3 points, which are what I just gave pretty explicitly. And if you actually look at data on evangelical Christians who still mostly do this, they have by far the happiest sexual relationships. Like high school girls don't feel pressured. Married people feel content most of the time, including women. Men probably learn to be reasonably good in bed if they want to keep having sex, even if there are some things they won't do and so forth. I'm being kind of cynical about this. I think we all know it's true. The sexual revolution, by breaking up a lot of that, actually produced some very good, very happy couples that have actually good sex and then go on to get married. But it also produced a lot of unsatisfying hookup culture. So, one of the major complaints from women today is, I find it very difficult to get men to commit. I find myself by date 2 or 3 almost forced to do things like have oral and anal sex that I don't want to do. Any massive poll of women from Ms. or Cosmo or something like this is going to reveal this, each answer from 20, 30% of women. And I kind of tie this, looking at statistical data, back to the Playboy philosopher and the first, feminist party girl magazines. Bust first came out in the 70s and so on. And there's a very definite trend line there, like sex doesn't necessarily have anything to do with love. The fact that you're willing to sleep with someone doesn't mean that you want to actually date them or please them on any frequent basis. And I'm talking a little bit in terms of pleasing your partner and so on about women falling away from expectations. But the same thing happened even more dramatically with men, right? Where men weren't expected to propose. Men weren't expected to have any level of affection for someone before sleeping with them. Even the old norms of gentlemanliness, like if you sleep with someone, you're expected to call them back for at least 2 more dates. Etiquette books used to include that. No, none of that. So people would be in this weird situation where they'd have vaginal, oral, and anal sex with a guy. It's quite common, at least growing up in Chicago. And then the guy would never speak to them again. And until pretty recently, if that happened, someone's brothers would beat you with a horsewhip. But now everyone's expected to treat that as just normal. Like, oh, I guess he wasn't feeling me. And everyone moves on. And the women have responded to that by ghosting men. Well, fuck him. I'm never talking to him. So you have all these people that are just suddenly not talking to you. You have these incredibly intimate experiences with people, and then the relationship ends. And I kind of point by point go back to the start of that and say, look, there's a lot of negativity to this, a lot of damage done by this. And 80% of women and at least half of men might be better served just to do the 4 dates and make sure you like the person. I mean, I think that's really good advice for a lot of people.
What do you think about that? That's helpful, by the way. Yeah, we used to be gentlemen and bring boxes of chocolates. Now we text an eggplant emoji and say, you up, and it's different. I've heard feminists argue on both sides of this, where some feminists will say the sexual revolution and what it's led to today is very empowering to women. Women should be sex workers. They should be involved online, whatever it is. But then I've heard other feminists that say, no, you're obviously objectifying her, and they don't really agree with each other. What are your thoughts on that tension in feminism?
Well, first of all, I will say, I don't think that a lot of feminist language like objectification, I don't mean to pick on the feminists here. I think that a lot of the black academics or the conservative guys we talked about in minute one are just as silly when it comes to trying to define things. Both of the groups I just mentioned, we use terms like heritage American or foundational black American. I mean, what the hell is that? If you bring that up to an Indian sometime and you'll get laughed out of the room. But I mean, but nonetheless, the silly pseudo-academic language is a pet peeve of mine. I don't think objectification means anything. I've debated this in a friendly fashion with serious feminist thinkers like Megan Murphy, and I've never heard a definition. Shout to her. But I mean, it seems to basically mean someone is looking at you and is attracted to you or wants you sexually without knowing your full psych profile. But if you took that seriously, you'd be objectifying almost every human you encountered.
It's biological.
Every time I go into Winston's Bagels down the street, I just want someone to make me food in a clean outfit without telling me a lot about their life. Am I taking the manager of this business and treating them as a subhuman creature? I don't think so. Every time I'm on the basketball court and I see a tall guy, I mean, my thought would be something like, pick up the tree, we'll dump it inside. That treating someone as less, I mean, it doesn't make sense. What you're doing is just taking a natural human reaction. Is she fine? If she's sane and down, I'd ask her out. I'd even hit it. You're taking that normal behavior and just putting a stupid label on it. That said, though, I think that the debate within feminism comes down to one block of feminists that think that anything a woman does is fine versus another block of feminists that are looking at quantitative data. I have to go with the second block of feminists. Like, in general, I think that as a free citizen, you can do what you want. But people who are saying that for the 80% majority of women, it's probably a good idea to wait until date 3 to have anal sex with somebody. I don't mean to be crude about this, but that's obviously true. I mean, for the majority of people, it's not a good idea to be a whore, an active prostitute. I mean, that's probably true. There are other people that would enjoy that job, actually. Like, there are plenty of people that are probably the equivalent of male mercenary soldiers that have a pretty low disgust reflex, that are pretty physically athletic, and that would rather have sex 3 times a week for 750 times 3 than work in a factory. If you ever talk to Ella or people like this online, they're fun, witty people that just explain this and say, I use protection. I'm fine. I think for that 10 to 20% of people, sex work might make sense. Maybe 5 to 10% of people. But for the majority of women who tend to be more sensitive and less aggressive than men, I think that the swerf feminists are probably correct. And it's the same thing with a lot of this stuff. Like, did the old rules work better than the new rules? Yeah. Should you wait a couple dates before sleeping with a man who might turn out to be a broke rapist? Yeah. Should you not be a professional prostitute? Yeah. So I think that you can say a woman in the new world can do almost anything. But I think that the traditional feminist or the gentleman who says, yeah, but you probably shouldn't, there's a lot more evidence for that. By the way, the idea that anything a woman does is okay is going to encounter a lot of problems. Like, your husband's not going to put up with that either. Hey, we haven't had sex for 2 weeks. It's okay because I'm a lady. Okay, but we're getting divorced. Like, I mean, it's just the idea that there are expectations in relationships, that as a woman, there is going to be an expectation of domesticity or sexuality or conversation. in exchange for, my sexuality in conversation, but also for access to this $500,000 a year income. I mean, like, it sucks to put it this way, but like, the reality those things are going to exist just is. So training people that it is not, that reality is not real, that you can be a hooker with no emotional damage, I think that's bad. So that is one of my complaints against like full on liberal feminism, like play girl philosopher stuff. I don't think it's based in reality.
That's helpful. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, excellent. So this question is kind of what you put at the very end of the book, which is really helpful. The continually, someone being continually oppressed as the narrative. What I find interesting, so part of the heart of what makes something like a conspiracy theory is there's no falsification principle. Whatever evidence you give somebody, they just kind of explain away. Is there a sense in which this I'm continually oppressed narrative, and there's nothing you can do to change it? Because I mean, even if you paid out reparations, would that just solve the issue and nobody would be mad anymore? So tell us a little bit about why do you think that so many people are not looking for a solution? Why do they want to be the victim? Why do they want to not have an answer? Give me your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, that's a really good line, that the thing about a conspiracy theory is that at some level it's, I would say, non-scientific, it's non-falsifiable in Popperian terms. So, and if I can go over that in a second, I think that's basically what you find, with a lot of the critical theory stuff. I'm going to leave the feminists alone, but I think most of us could see that with feminism as well and with the manosphere response. So like, there's a pay gap. Well, no, there's not. If you just adjust for the type of jobs men and women do, women are better at childcare, men at war. War pays a little bit. Why does war pay more? Maybe we overvalue you just go, everything would be a step back to the Bailey and then a step back to the Bailey. But the ultimate example of this would be the BLM CRT people, where like the explanation for everything is racism. And like, I'll actually go through one of these sequences right now that I had in a formal debate over the editing of an academic paper. And the conversation is something like this, like, well, obviously differences in performance, such as hiring and arrest rate between blacks and whites, are due to racism. Dr. Reilly, in your role as reviewer, witness, whatever, would you disagree with that? Well, yeah, I would disagree with that. It turns out that if you adjust for three things, age, region, and test scores, that gap goes away. Well, Dr. Reilly, would you disagree that the difference in at least test scores there is due to racism? Are you saying black people are inferior? No, obviously I don't think black people are inferior, but I do think we study half as much for tests as whites. Whites study half as much as Asians. So you see a very mappable gap in SAT scores of 950 for blacks, 1100 for whites, 1250 for Asians. It's literally that, by the way. Like it literally you can look this up. It literally tracks exactly with the study time. Okay, but you obviously must feel that the differences in study time are due to lower income for blacks than for poor whites, which is caused by racism. And by this point, it's just like, oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, no, I don't think whites suffer racism relative to Cambodia. It's like, no, I feel that the performance on the athletic field of blacks and poor whites explains about half of this. Then you have to look at seeking of jobs. Well, perhaps the seeking of jobs by blacks and poor whites is due to oppression, which is due to past racism. No, I mean, you can just go by, and I didn't explain that brilliant, but I think you got the sequence. And it just goes on and on and on, so that every time you fall back and explain, every time you explain, you fall back again. It's kind of the racism of the gaps, the old God of the gaps thing in the Gish-Gallup creationist bad argument. I would say I'd say that's true for most conspiracy theories. If reparations were paid to black people, I would virtually guarantee that what had happened, and I love my black Americans, but what had happened would be basically the Chappelle Show skit where all these brothers are driving trucks and Newport cigarettes and saying things like, I just bought this baby cash and look at my racing dogs, and then you'd see very little improvement in educational outcomes. Why did that happen? Well, racism. It didn't have anything to do with the spending spree. Well, the spending spree was prompted by a desire to look like performative members of upper middle class society, which was, of course, motivated by racism. And on, backward and backward, Gish-Galloping it would go. Why do people feel a desire to do this, to be oppressed? I don't really think you need a complex answer. I think it's just sort of standard excuse making to some extent. People are not entirely aware at the conscious level of their mind of how to actually fix problems, or they do not want to, or they are scared to, or they think the problems are too complex. So you come up with this automatic excuse that can never be defeated, I think. People don't want to say I'm genetically inferior, which also isn't true, but which would be 100% explainer. So you just say racism's out there, sexism's out there. And I mean, there are two things that does. One, it's 100% solution to the problem. Three, it always excuses all your behavior. And three, you're not in the weird, complex zone that a real answer might leave you in. So, I mean, if you're looking at why women under-earn men, part of the answer is probably going to be, for a lot of business women, I don't want to be in the most brutal, most unpleasant jobs where you have the highest concentration of men. I'm not interested in being an underwater welder. Like, those big boys are in those fields because they're the sole breadwinner for their family. They have a traditional, quote unquote, submissive wife who stays home. There are a few things that are in it for them. There's no way in hell I'm doing that. I'm not driving a garbage truck. So it's a lot easier just to say, well, there's still some bigotry out there, but I managed to earn 89% of what they do. And I think it's pretty easily understandable why someone would choose that explanation over the one I just gave a second ago.
Man, that's super helpful. Dr. Reilly, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, for everybody listening, highly recommend that you go out and get you a copy or a few. I've got it on Audible and in hard copy. It'll challenge you regardless of your political leanings. It'll challenge you regardless of your religious leanings. It's really a lot of fun. So, Dr. Reilly, again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you and your wisdom and what you do.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.